It is now the end of August, and that is back to school time. Being back to school time, local stores will often proudly display many different notebooks and pens and backpacks and things for students to load up their backpacks with. The paper is not premium paper and it is not designed for fountain pens. But as I was roaming through the aisles and the stacks of paper, it got me wondering which of these papers would be best suited for the fountain pen using, budget conscious students that I'm sure will be watching this video. So I loaded up the arms of my tiny assistant and future student and set out to find which paper is the most fountain pen compatible. When I started to look deeper into the shelves of the paper, I found that my local store mostly carried the Top Flight brand of paper. So I did what I could to get as much variety as I could. What I was able to get was this 5-star one subject notebook, a Top Flight one subject notebook, a Top Flight composition book, a Mead grid paper, and this Studio C one subject notebook. So now we have to figure out what we are testing. I wanted to keep the testing criteria as relevant to how students use the paper, and I wanted to avoid any feels or the aesthetics of the paper, because in the end, it's how it works and not just how it looks and feels. I chose 4 aspects to judge the paper on. The first criteria I chose was feathering. A lot of cheaper paper will be very fibrous, and is in that when you zoom in, you'll see lots of fiber strands that go in every direction. And these strands might absorb the ink in different ways. When you have a line that you're trying to make, feathering is the ink that goes perpendicular to the line that you want. I really wanted to find the paper that had the least amount of feathering. The next problem that cheaper paper has is that liquid ink can go straight through to the other side, making the backside unusable. So bleeding is definitely one of the things I'm going to be looking into, especially if it bleeds onto the second page. So not just through the main page, but onto the next one. The next criteria has to do with the fact that fountain pen ink is fuller and darker than ballpoint ink. So with each line being more pronounced, how much do you see the line from the backside of the page? So if it's too transparent, then you can't use the backside. So then it almost cuts the amount of pages that you're able to write on in half. The final criteria is a little bit more subjective. Much like feathering and bleeding, if a page is absorbent, then it will suck the ink out of the pen instead of letting the fountain pen's natural flow to let the ink just go out onto the page. The more absorbent paper will really suck the ink out and make a line really fat. I'm going to be testing how fat each line comes from an extra fine and a fine. Now for my testing method. For testing, I decided to write a very short quote that I would write at a moderate to quick pace to simulate note-taking. I also wanted to test an extra fine and a fine with black ink because I figured that this might be the most common for students. Or maybe it's just me. But I also wanted to make it harder for the paper, so I used other inks, a medium nib, and also a flex nib to really get the ink flowing and just see how much it could take. The pens I used for testing was the Lamy Aeon in an extra fine, the Lamy 2000 in a fine, the TWSBI Eco in a fine, the Visconti Van Gogh in a medium, and the Pilot Custom 912 in a soft fine. The black ink that I'm using is the standard Lamy Black. The orange I'm using is Diamine Pumpkin. And the purple ink that I'm using in both Visconti and the Pilot is Waterman Tender Purple. Feathering was not as big of an issue as I initially expected. The 5-star definitely had feathering for both the extra fine and the fine. The Top Flight single notebook also had some feathering for both the extra fine and the fine. But once we got to the Top Flight composition book, there was no longer any feathering for either the extra fine or the fine. And the same thing with the Mead grid paper. No feathering on the fine or extra fine. And same thing with the Studio C single subject notebook. No feathering for the extra fine or find or anything else. I wasn't as surprised by the bleeding results, because I would hope that a fine and extra fine wouldn't put out enough ink to really bleed. One thing that did have a factor was that one paper let the medium nib bleed all the way through to the next page. The 5-star did have bleeding for the medium and the flex, but the flex nib also went all the way through to the second page. The Top Flight single subject also had bleeding for the medium nib and the flex nib, and it also allowed for bleeding onto the second page for the medium and the flex nib. The Top Flight composition book allowed for bleeding for the medium and the flex nib, but it didn't let the bleeding go all the way through the second page. And the same thing with the Mead grid, bleeding for the medium and the flex nib, but no bleeding onto the second page. I was surprised for the Studio C because it did not let the bleeding go through for any of the pens, not even the flex. What was a bigger issue than I had initially expected was transparency of the pages. Full disclosure, I didn't have the transparency as one of my initial criteria until when I was reviewing the results of the bleeding that I noticed that a lot of these pages were very transparent and I could really read through them. So starting with the 5-star, it had very low transparency, but you could still make out what was on the other side. The Top Flight was very transparent, not blocking any of the view from the other side. Also the same thing with the Top Flight composition book. You could really see everything on the other side of the paper. The Mead grid paper was the best performing out of all of them, where you had very little transparency, so you could barely see what was on the other side, but you could still see it. And lastly, the Studio C, which was also very transparent. I found that the Top Flight composition book provided the thinnest and most consistently thin line throughout the entire quote. The second place was actually the Studio C, and then third place was the 5-star, then the Top Flight, and then the Mead grid paper. I think there was no hands-down winner because the paper really wasn't designed to be used for fountain pens. It was designed to be cheap and available for students to use and to throw away. But if I was going to have to choose one overall winner, I would have to go with the Studio C. Initially, I had the lowest expectations for this paper because it was so thin and it was transparent even without anything written on it. But it passed all the criteria with no feathering, no bleeding, and no bleeding on the second page, and it had the second best line width. But of course, the biggest trade-off is that it is very transparent. The second place, I would have to go with the Top Flight composition book because it performed very similar to the Studio C, but with a little bit of bleeding from the medium and the flex nibs. It was really hard to choose the first two, so the third, fourth, and fifth places are just going to get all, participation trophies so that way they can take it home to their mothers and they can be proud. Thank you for watching. If you like my style of review, please comment and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out so that way you can be notified whenever I come up with my next reviews or videos. Thank you.